Well, I guess they'll jump up and down if they can't.
Okay.
So yes, it looks as if everyone can hear us online. So thank you everyone for attending this presentation today. So our speaker today is a PhD student, collector of jaw harps, fabulous player of the double bass in many different ensembles, former worker, I forgot your title, trainer at Living Languages, formerly the RNLD. What did that stand for? Resource Network for Linguistic Diversity. And has been a PhD student on a project that we are working on that will eventually produce a dictionary of the Wurundjeri language, that we're working closely with the Wurundjeri Corporation. And so this project that Andrew's doing has that close community consultation aspect as well. And Andrew's been diving into old manuscripts, and you're about to hear the results of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me just share the screen. Okay, is that working? Oh, great. Now I can't see the preview. That's frustrating. What's happening? Okay, I think I'll have to do it I'm assuming that everyone can see the presentation online.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just don't have the preview screen, which is annoying. Okay, so thank you for coming to my talk. This is my mid-candidature talk. The eagle-eyed amongst you will notice I've swapped around recovery and discovery in the talk title. I thought I'd start with the recovery section. The structure of the talk is very straightforward. Actually, now I'm not sure that I'll be able to. Okay, I can, great. I just have to do two things at once. Okay, the structure of the talk is very straightforward. I'm going to discuss the recovery section first. So that's about the database that we've been building. And then a couple of interesting discoveries that I've made as part of the process of building the database. As is customary in these things, I need to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where I'm giving this talk, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And we should acknowledge elders past and present as a matter of course, but in this particular case, it's particularly significant, obviously, for this study because it is the, I have to click on that. It is the, it's the elders past who have actually had it's because of the elders past and also the elders present that we have anything to study. So the elders present have requested that a dictionary be made of the Wurundjeri language. This is a photograph of Uncle William Barrack, who we believe to be the last fluent speaker of the Wurundjeri language, and most of you will have heard about him. He's depicted here in this photograph painting traditional corroboree images. That's one of the things he did later in life. He was a very significant source at the end of the period of documentation of this language, but also at the very beginning. So his lifespan kind of encompasses the whole story of the documentation of the Wurundjeri language. So he's actually, not only was he the most important source in the later period, sort of in the last part of the 19th century, but he's actually, his name is amongst the very first mentioned as a source for the Wurundjeri language. So that's one little thing that I found in a document. George Langhorne in 1838 referred to the boy Barrack as a source for language when he was just a little boy going to school at the very first mission school in the area. So not only was he a very important language source at the end of that period for people like Howitt and John Matthew and R.H. Matthews, and possibly also John Green and E.M. Kerr. But then also decades after he died in 1903, Louis Hercus reported words from Wurundjeri elders who remembered him from their childhood as well. So and these are the only words that we have on tape. So he's a very significant person, and I guess, yeah, encompasses this whole story. So moving on to the recovery, so the database, by way of introduction. So here are this is the Victorian Aboriginal Corporation for Languages map of the languages of Victoria, just to give you an idea of the area we're talking about. These are what are conventionally referred to as the Eastern Kulin languages. So you can see we've got Wurrung here, and also we've got Bunurong to the south on the coast, and Tongarong to the north, and also Nguraylam, which I won't be going into today, is also believed to be an Eastern Kulin language. These languages haven't been spoken as a language of daily communication for well over 100 years, but there are active revitalization programs going on. So sorry, I have to keep on clicking between these two to get anything happening. So the project, as Stephen mentioned, is to create a dictionary. Part of that process is reconstructing as much as we can of the historical relationships and morphosyntax phonology of these languages. This is based on a request from the community, and it's part of an attempt to sort of decolonize the archives, get as much available to the community as possible. And of course, it has scientific interest as well. So probably the most significant aspect of this is sort of a more exhaustive approach to the archives, trying to get as much as possible, making available almost, as far as we can tell, all the archival materials available in the Eastern Kulin languages. So this was sort of started by Barry Blake and Bob Dixon, and continued by Stephen Morey. The largest previous study in 1991, Barry Blake's study of these languages used about 30 source documents, by the way that I count them, and about 16 different recorders, that is, people who recorded the languages. In our database, as it currently stands, we've got well over 150 documents now from about 24 different recorders. We've got about 20,000 separate recordings, that is, sort of rows in the database. These could be words or phrases, sentences, even small texts. So it's a significant increase. The nature of the data is, as you might imagine, it's very messy. So this is the big problem. Very messy data. It's dispersed throughout archives around Australia, also overseas. So Stephen's come across things in archives in South Africa, for example. With the exception of those Louise Hercus recordings, there's no audio recordings of sort of first language speakers or even fluent speakers. The recorders who did write these things down are incredibly unreliable. They didn't have much idea about linguistic concepts, of course, in the 19th century, but they generally had a very poor aptitude for languages just in general. Most of them were just English speakers with very little experience with other languages of any kind. We have lots of different kinds of data in the database, so down to words or even some just morphemes listed, phrases, sentences, even there's song text, there's dialogues. Most of the dialogues are sort of artificial. They've been created by non-Aboriginal recorders. Lots of different orthographies, very little consistency in those orthographies. Problems with legibility of documents, lots of contradictions and discrepancies, and very little metadata. So we often just know very little about where these lists were recorded, who they spoke to, what language they thought they were recording, and dates and things like that. I should just mention that we are talking about the Eastern Kulin languages as a whole, even though the main aim is to do analysis on the Wurrung. We also, because of the sketchiness around the metadata, we're casting the net wide and trying to figure out exactly what is the relationship between all these languages. So just as an example, this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. So this is just an example of a document that I might have to look at. This is not unusual in any sense. You can see that it's messy. It contains lots of deletions. It's got sort of splodges and blurs, and there's legibility issues. There's even some shorthand in there, which is not particularly common, but it does happen in a few documents. So this one's from William Thomas, probably in the early 1840s. Oops. So, and this is, once we have done transcriptions, this is another sort of common issue that we find ourselves coming up against is, you can see there, we've got huge, these are all, as far as we can tell, I can guarantee these are all attempts to represent the same phonological form that we can sort of generally gloss as white man. Believe it or not, these are all the same word. You can see what the issues are there. People are having trouble hearing the initial velar nasal. There's a lot of variation even in final consonants, either being dropped off or being heard as very different things. This is a very widely attested word, very common to find it in the word lists. So despite this sort of chaos, we can figure this one out pretty well. I'll leave it to you to do the analysis. I'm not going to do that now. You can probably figure out, you can probably guess that Louise Herkes had the best idea about what was going on here. But the question is, how do we manage this kind of metadata, this kind of messy data? How do we produce anything useful out of it? So we have just been, initially it was a spreadsheet, and just a conventional spreadsheet with, and as it grew and grew and grew, getting up to thousands and thousands and thousands of rows, and it's really hasn't been practical. So over the last during my candidature, we've been trying to figure out the best way to put this into a more robust database, and lots of false starts and dead ends. It's been quite tricky, not coming from a computational background and not really knowing where to turn. Most recently, we've figured out, started a collaboration with computer science students at La Trobe, who are doing their sort of capstone subject in database construction. So building this relational database, I was hoping to get a working model by this week. Unfortunately, that's not happening. Next week apparently is, well, that's the end. That's their, apparently tools down is next week. So they're all, as you might imagine, working till the last possible minute on it. So it's a big improvement. So we've got a customizable, we'll have a customizable interface for sort of structured queries, fuzzy string recognition, so that will allow for spelling variation. That's learning applications in the future if the steering committee of elders is keen on that sort of thing. And the idea is this will be scalable and extensible, so it may be applicable to other projects, other similar projects in the future. And there is a bit of, here's a bit of technical detail for anybody who's interested in that kind of thing. If you have any questions about this kind of stuff, just bear in mind that I probably can't answer it at the moment, but hopefully I'll be able to in the not too distant future. So that's where we're at with the database. Yes, unfortunately, I wasn't able to show you a working model of that, but stay tuned and I'll be able to update you with all the other sort of research outcomes that come out of that as well. So that's the end of the recovery side of things. And now I wanted to move on to the discovery. So the first major discovery I wanted to talk about, this is one that's more related to the history, I would say the history of language documentation in Victoria, has major linguistic implications, but it's not so much a linguistic study in itself. So this is related to a manuscript that's held at the State Library of Victoria here. That is, you can see one of the title pages for it in the background there, Lexicon of the Australian Aboriginal Tongue. It's conventionally been attributed to William Thomas, who was Assistant Protector of the Aborigines in the Port Phillip district in the 1840s. But almost nothing else was known about this document. So thanks to our approach of being as exhaustive as possible, it basically became apparent this is not William Thomas at all. Everything that we thought we knew about this document was wrong. I'm referring to it as the Pentridge lexicon for reasons that you will figure out shortly. So coming back to this map again, this document is about it's about 400 pages long, and it contains language data based on these 6 locations. I say locations because the languages were identified in the document by location rather than by language name. So these are the locations as named. So it refers to them as the Ballarat tribe, the Bacchus Marsh tribe, the Melbourne tribe, and so on. Most linguistic analyses so far have agreed that these probably correspond to these 6 more appropriate language or tribal designations. Number 3, of course, being Wurrung, of most interest to our study. Moving along. So this is what the document looks like. There are, you can see this is just the English to language section of the document. Each language is identified by a number in this case. That's just an example of what it looks like. It was obviously hand copied. It's about 400 pages long. It's a big document. It contains literally thousands of words, phrases, and there are some traditional song texts in there, some sort of mock-ups of dialogues between speakers of the language. There's also, really importantly, 50 pages of rough notes at the back, which seem to be in a very different hand to these ones here. And seem to comprise original elicitation notes from the first 3 languages listed here. So that's the Ballarat, Bacchus Marsh, and Melbourne. This is a very important document for a number of reasons. One of them is the phonetic accuracy. So if you have a look here, you can see there's lots of sort of unusual digraphs and diacritics here. This is actually quite an incredibly accurate and consistent orthography that the author has devised, that much more consistent than anything else we have of that time. And it would actually, it's a little bit clumsy, but it actually kind of stands up as phonemic orthography to this day, really. It has a huge quantity of data in different languages. There's song text, so on, but there's so little metadata. It's hard to use the document because we don't know how to analyze it. Very quickly, there's a bad quality scan there, and here's a transcription of what the cover page says. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but the key thing here is you'll see these words like with a, and a grammatical summary by W. Thomas Esquire, JP, Guardian of the Aborigines. So you can probably guess how this confusion came about. So the State Library has this document. My suggestion is there was some error with cataloguing at some point in the distant past. It hasn't been really recorded when that was. So the question is around the scope of that attribution there. So in fact, almost none of it, it's only that last tiny grammatical summary, which disagrees with everything else in the document, that can be attributed to William Thomas. The rest of it is not by William Thomas. So who was William Thomas? He was the protector, this was his official role, the Assistant Protector of the Aborigines with the Port Phillip District. And then later the Guardian of the Aborigines, that was his official title. Can't go into the details of that now, but generally speaking, he had positive relationships with Aboriginal groups in this area. And he was a major documenter of the languages of this area, particularly of Wurrung and Bunurong, as we'll discuss later as well. But he really had a sort of a pragmatic approach to languages, about communication, control, and also things like sermon translations, Bible translations. So he was a missionary as well. And he was not very good at language, unfortunately. So he had a lot of time, a lot of close contact with these people, but very little aptitude for language, unfortunately. And I'm very, very familiar with his work. I've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of things that he's transcribed, and I understand what his abilities and what his orthography is like, and it's nothing like what's in this document. So this is the only bit that is attributable to him. Grammatical summary, which is about 7 pages of this document, which is actually not relevant to the rest of the document. Now, Stephen told me that because I seem to be interested in this question, he said, well, there actually is another copy of this book, and it's held at the Royal Anthropological Institute in London. And this is the book plates on one of the volumes. So it's in 2 different volumes. I wanted to show you this because I think it's particularly beautiful. So this is held in London. They don't know how they got it. The Royal Anthropological Institute doesn't know where it came from. It's in their archives, and it's got this label on it, exhibited by Colonel W. Champ at the Intercolonial Exhibition in Melbourne, 1866. It looks like this, different hand, different way of designating the languages. This first volume only has 4 languages in it. The second volume has 2 more languages in it. To my notes here. Okay, the other thing is that it has a couple of extra details in it. So in the preface, this copy of the lexicon has this key place name here, Pentridge, 25th of December, 1861. Notice it's Christmas Day, which I think is significant as well. Now, Pentridge, most of you will know that Pentridge is still there. It's no longer a prison, but it closed down not that long ago as a prison. Pentridge was also the name of the surrounding area, which is now called Coburg. This is just down the road from my house, by the way. So I thought, well, this is interesting. What have we got here? We've got W. Champ, we've got Pentridge. Who was W. Champ? Well, he was William Champ, and he was the superintendent of Pentridge Prison and lots and lots of other things as well, which I don't have time to go into. But he took over Pentridge Prison in 1857 and was a real modernizer by the standards of the day, and was quite keen to turn Pentridge Prison into something new and exciting and modern. And part of that was to turn Pentridge into a productive place. So making workshops, they produced hats, buckets, items of clothing. What else was there? Various things, but he also was interested in promoting these products at these exhibitions. So he would always have a Pentridge stand at these major exhibitions that were being held. They were all the rage at the time. I don't have time to go into that in detail. But if we look into the catalogues of those exhibitions, we find that he was also exhibiting traditional Aboriginal weapons and wood carvings, and also, as you might have guessed, this lexicon was part of the Pentridge exhibition in the 1866 exhibition. So with that information, I was then able to go into the archives, the Public Records Office of Victoria specifically, and dig around, gone through all these various letters, prison records and so on, and have managed to figure out this much about it. The lexicon was produced at Pentridge Prison in 1861. Champ was responsible for this project, but did not actually make the document himself. Whoever did make this document interviewed 6 Aboriginal men for this data. And then a copy was later made in 1864 by another prisoner. And this was then, at some point, this copy was deposited at the State Library Victoria by Champ himself. But he exhibited this lexicon at the Melbourne exhibition in 1866, and that copy somehow ended up in London. We still don't know how, and we don't know who wrote it. So my question then is, well, who were these 6 men that are mentioned in the book? And doing further digging around, well, here's an example of, this is from the preliminary notes from the elicitation sessions for the lexicon. There's a few little hints like this. So this is a note regarding the word or centipede in 3 of these languages. So it's kind of clear that one person provided information for 3 of these languages. And you can see here, so bunner, stripe, bill, sting. So the word is bunner bill. Apparently striped stinger. Peter says he does not know from what part the centipede stings, whether tail or something, but bill stands for that. So there's a few little clues like this, including the name Peter. So what we're looking for is, who we're looking for is someone called Peter, who was at Pentridge and spoke these three languages. This agrees with an observation that Barry Blake made in 1991. The reason why he didn't use this document as a source for the Melbourne language was because it seems to be a strange mix of Woiwurrung and Wadawurrung, which is the Kulin language to the west, spoken in the Geelong area or Bacchus Marsh area. And so luckily, there are some historical records around this, and I was able to find out who this Peter was. This is somebody who we do know something about. His name was Peter Mungett. And then by going through hundreds, if not thousands of prisoner records, I was able to find essentially the 6 Aboriginal prisoners who were in Pentridge that year, and they all match up precisely to the locations as mentioned in the lexicon. So, and we do actually have biographical information about these people, and we know where they came from, and we know something about their lives. So this can tell us something now about what we how we can go about analysing these documents, and it helps confirm Barry Blake's suspicions. And there's a reason why the data for Woiwurrung and Wadawurrung at least seem to be mixed up, and that's to do with the languages spoken by Peter Mungett. It tells us something. It could tell us something interesting about the nature of multilingualism in the area as well. So another thing that I've just come across recently, I mentioned the Aboriginal weapons that Champ exhibited for Pentridge. Well, these have also ended up in London as well at the British Museum. So there's at least 3 weapons at the British Museum that were made by some of these same men, including Peter Mungett. So this is a shield that Peter made. And this is the official information here down here. So made by Mungett, now Bacchus Marsh, prisoner in the penal establishment Pentridge. So there's at least 3 of these weapons at the British Museum now. I don't know how they got there, unfortunately. The last big question for me is, well, who wrote this document? And it's somebody who had, unlike William Thomas, had a lot of aptitude for language. Also, unlike Thomas, was much more conventionally sort of racist and dismissive of the day. So we're looking for somebody who is not familiar with Aboriginal culture, is familiar with languages. I've gone through, this is just a small sample of the candidates, by the way. I've gone and I've lots and lots of very frustrating dead ends, but I can basically rule out all of these people, unfortunately, and I still don't know. My hunch is that it must have been, remember that it was signed on, there's actually 2 dates on the document. One is 25th of December, the other one is 1st of January. And they'll both indicate as being at Pentridge. Who is in prison on Christmas Day and New Year's Day? Either a staff member or a prisoner. So it's quite likely to have been an educated prisoner, but I've drawn a blank on pretty much every lead I've looked at, but I'm continuing to look. So that's discovery 1. I think it's important that to be able to have these names and to bring to our attention the very strange history of this document. It seems to me that Champ was trying to keep it a bit of a secret. I think maybe he knew that there was something not quite right about this, but it's very interesting that we've got this sort of significant document that was produced at really what was the symbol for oppressive institutions in the colony of Victoria. So under what circumstances were these men providing this linguistic information? It's a very interesting question. Not a lot of answers so far. Unfortunately, William Chant burnt most of his papers, so we may never know. Moving on to the second discovery, and that is what I'll say is an overlooked language. So this is a bit unexpected. So not just sort of a document here, a manuscript there, a word list here. This actually seems to be a whole language that's been hiding in plain sight in the archives. Not just in the archives, in this case, even in sort of published word lists. So coming back to our map here, so this is southern Victoria. We've got Woiwurrung here and Bunurong here. So we also have Tongarong to the north. So these are all the conventionally identified Eastern Kulin languages. This is what we normally understand to be the Eastern Kulin languages. Wadawurrung is another Kulin language to the west. And there's other Western Kulin languages up here, but these are the languages I'm referring to. And also I'm going to be touching on the Gunarkona language of Gippsland as well. But we're particularly interested in these two languages. What is the relationship between these two languages? This has actually been a question that people have been asking for the whole history of the documentation of these languages. So I'm certainly not the first, but I do have some new data that might shed light on this question. So starting in 1840, William Thomas basically said these two languages are the same. These two tribes speak the same language. And then based on a couple of word lists, Robert Bruff Smythe in 1878 came to the same conclusion. Then R.H. Matthews made the same claim in 1902. Bob Dixon had the same belief based on his sources. Barry Blake, who was probably using the same or similar sources to Dixon, came to the same conclusion. So people have been asking this question for a long time. And we're talking, in the case of Dixon and Blake, they're referring to lexicostatistical studies. And we're looking, Barry Blake made the claim that it was actually about 93% similar. So very, very similar. It's essentially the same language. There's no difference. Barry Blake didn't have access to all the documents that we now have access to. So this was Blake's table where he's basically demonstrating a dialect continuum from Tongarong in the north down to Bunurong in the south, with basically almost no difference between Woiwurrung and Bunurong. So that's that's Bunurong there and Woiwurrung here. I've underlined the words that are the same. Generally with these languages, either the word is exactly the same or it's something completely different. We don't tend to have a lot of, there's some small examples of some phonological processes going on. So Willem and Yillum, for example, but these are quite unusual. Generally, it's either the same word or a different word. So then imagine my surprise when I'm going through a bunch of word lists from George Augustus Robinson from the 1840s. So this is early documentation. We find these words that are, again, I've underlined the ones that are the same. This is his own orthography. So these underlined ones are the same, no problem, but these ones are completely different. So these are not cognates at all. And then there's a couple here that are apparently cognates, but they're substantially different forms. So who was George Augustus Robinson? Well, we talked about William Thomas. He was the assistant protector. Well, Robinson was the chief protector for about 13 years in 1849. He left Melbourne in 1852. He's a very problematic figure, and for a number of reasons, but he's interesting because of the work that he did in Tasmania prior to arriving in Victoria, he was actually familiar with a lot of the cultural concepts that were relevant in Victoria that a lot of the other people just had no idea about, things like exogamous marriages and things like that. So he did a lot of language work, and most of which we can kind of trust. It's difficult to interpret, but most of it's pretty good. He made a huge number of word lists and terrible handwriting, and then he took it all with him back to the UK when he left. So he actually has had very little influence on our understanding of the languages of the area until more recent decades, when his stuff has begun to become more accessible. So he produced about 8 manuscripts of varying length in a language of a documenting a language variety that he variously described as something recognizably Bunurong, in one case Western Port, which is the only word list that remained in Australia as far as I can tell, but has been ignored. And so that's a total of about 350 unique items in this language. Most of these lists were transcribed by Ian Clark around the year 2000, and they have been published. They're not easily accessible, but they are out there. And just as an example, this is one example of what these word lists look like and why I think it's genuine. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but it says he's comparing to, this seems to be from Benbow, and he's comparing 2 different language varieties. You'll have to take my word for it. That says Bunurong, and this is Woiwurrung, something like Woiwurrung. And so this seems to be a list that he's elicited from a multilingual speaker named Benbow in these 2 different languages. You can see here this ditto is, well, that means ditto, but it's the same word in both languages. Generally, it's not. So who was Benbow? He was a very important leader of the Yalukit Willem clan. He was employed by Robinson as a messenger between tribes in the area. He was also friends with William Thomas, knew him very well. Also George Hayden, who I might mention in a bit. Going to move along. So the methodology, what I need to do is compare these word lists and try and figure out how closely are these languages in fact related. So bearing in mind that Blake gave a figure of around 93%, which is extraordinarily high, basically means the same language. So we need to use lexicostatistics rather than most other methods, because George Robinson only recorded individual words, and it's very difficult to extract reliable grammatical information from his documentation. So we're just trying to quantify the degree of relatedness between these 2 varieties, or more varieties in this case. And we get 1 mark for a cognate and 0 marks for a non-cognate if they have a matching gloss. So based on Dixon, I know some of the theories here are somewhat controversial, but the main things that we're interested in here is Dixon's statement that if you got more than 70%, we're looking at dialects of the same language. If you got less than 40%, these languages are not closely related. And then in between, we've got the equilibrium range and so on. We don't need to get into that because actually none of our languages fit into that, that zone there. The key thing that I'm doing here is just focusing only on Robinson's lists. I'm not looking at most of the other work that's been done in lexicostatistical studies in Victoria has been compilations of word lists. What I'm interested in is making sure that we're comparing like with like, only using early word lists, only using Robinson where possible, so that we know that we're comparing like with like. He was also much more reliable than most in terms of saying which language he's documenting at any given time. So just to remind you, oops, lost it. Okay, so these are the languages that I've compared. These are all Robinson word lists except for the Woiwurrung word list. He didn't seem to make one for Woiwurrung. There was a word list from this language in his papers, but it seems to be in a different hand, and I think was by Charles Sivright, the assistant protector in that area. And these are the figures that I came up with. You can see the percentages and the token counts in brackets. The area, the 3 rows at the bottom, this is all consistent with work that Barry Blake has done in this area. So none of this is surprising at all. Notice here we do have this figure over 70% for Woiwurrung and Tongarong. So this indicates, yes, this confirms what we already believed. These are closely related languages, if not dialects of the same language. Everything else is sort of in that sort of 40% or below figure. Gunai, this is the land from the language of Gippsland. We can see this is only very distantly related. But this figure here is what we're interested in, a figure of only 34% with, quite a large list. I don't have time to go into the details of how we broke this down, but there's I did break it into semantic domains and basic and non-basic items and things like that. But we don't have time to go into it. So that's clearly indicating that what we've got here is a very different language, and it's sort of on par with the distance between Wathaurong and Wawarong as well. Now, some examples of non-cognates. So these are examples in George Robinson's word list that are clearly not the same in his own orthography. And my question is, well, how the hell did William Thomas not notice that there was something else going on here? He worked there for decades. He never noticed that there was a different language being spoken. Well, the answer is maybe he did. He just wasn't very good at communicating that. So back to here. So there's this book at another book at the State Library Victoria here that is let's call it the Aboriginal Word Book. That's what he called it. It's mostly in what I would recognise as being consistent with Woiwurrung, but there's a few cases where he's listed some what appear to be synonyms. And sometimes he even marks them with different symbols. So the word for smoke, Burt, that's what we would expect for Woiwurrung or similar languages. And this word darm is similar to Robinson's Bunurong lists. And then at the bottom there, we've got the word for no good, Nilam, which he's put W there, which I'm guessing is Woiwurrung. And Benong PP. PP was his abbreviation for Port Phillip, which is the area where the Bunurong live. So we've got a couple of dozen examples of this where Thomas has recorded these synonyms, which may in fact have been different language varieties that he hasn't identified. And George Hayden also recorded some of these in the 1840s. And so we do have some support for these. You can have a look at them there. And the other thing that that has just come to light is a further list that is not all of these lists from Robinson have either mentioned no consultant or mentioned this name Benbow, and Benbow was from this particular area in Port Melbourne. Well, there's one actually what turns out to be the earliest word list from this area, 1836. So this is the very first word list that recording any of these languages. Also from George Robinson. Benbow is not mentioned, but Derrimut is. This is a portrait of Derrimut. He was from the same clan, the same patriline as Benbow. And this list is consistent with Robinson's other Bunurong lists. So that's a bit of support there. Now, I don't have time to go into this in detail, but all the word lists that have been used previously may have been, there's just very little metadata about them. So that's why people like Smythe and even Dixon and Blake were relying on these word lists that actually may not have been representative at all. I can go into that in more detail some other time, perhaps. So to conclude, we're at the end now. So basically, the two major discoveries there. So the lexicon at Pentridge that we now know a lot more about, and we understand the context for the linguistic analysis. Still don't know the author, but we at least do know the Aboriginal men who were interviewed under some circumstances. In fact, the author used the term cross-examined, which is telling. And then identification of a language variety that hasn't been recognised, at least by linguists, since 1850. It's not closely related to any of the surrounding languages, but was spoken by at least one group in Port Phillip Bay, who we believe to be the Bunurong group. And I think that's also testament to the how overlooked George Robinson's work has been, because his papers were in private hands until the middle of the 20th century, and even then have been very difficult to access and to transcribe and interpret since then. So in conclusion, this is where the project is going, making this archival data accessible to community and to linguistic analysis, extending our current understanding of the so-called Eastern Kulin languages, development of the database and the dictionary for the community. And it's clear, even it's just a couple of examples, that there are still significant discoveries to be made in the archives. Thank you all. And thank you to Stephen as well for getting me involved in this project.
Well, yes, you've already justified your last 2 years' work on this in solving these two problems. It's not every day that we discover that there's a new language, basically in the area where I live, so that we didn't think was a separate language. So yeah, anyway, we've got quite a bit of time for discussion. We've got another 15 minutes or so. So okay, we'll turn off the recording so you can speak.